At my dad's retirement party, he thought it would be a hilarious joke to grab the microphone and introduce me to a room full of people by saying, "This is my daughter. She has no degree, no future, and just freeloads off the family." Hundreds of people laughed. I did not flinch. I just smiled, lifted my glass, and said, "Cheers, because this is the last time any of you will ever see me." Then I walked out. The entire room went completely silent. But to understand how we got to that catastrophic moment, you have to understand the double life I was living. My name is Jessica. I am 29 years old. To my parents and my sister, I was just a struggling diner waitress who dropped out of community college and never amounted to anything. I want you to picture the bone-deep exhaustion of working a double shift at a busy highway diner. I would work 14 hours straight, carrying heavy trays of thick ceramic plates and dodging angry line cooks in a sweltering kitchen. My feet would swell so badly by the end of the day that taking my cheap black work shoes off felt like peeling off a layer of skin. I always smelled like burnt coffee, old grease, and cheap lemon floor cleaner. I would stand in the shower at the end of the night and scrub my arms until they were red and raw, but the scent of the diner was permanently attached to me. I would wake up with my lower back aching and my hands dry and cracked from constantly washing heavy silverware and harsh industrial chemicals. That was the life I chose to show my family. It was a brutal, exhausting facade, but I played the part perfectly. Every single Friday afternoon, I would take the crumpled cash from my tip jar, smooth out the damp $1 and $5 bills, and drive my rusted sedan over to my father's construction supply business. My dad, Robert, owned a company that was perpetually on the brink of absolute failure. His office was a small, dusty box attached to a warehouse. It always smelled like sawdust, stale sweat, and old cigars. His desk was covered in bright red final notice bills, angry letters from unpaid vendors, and past due invoices that he ignored. I would walk into his office still wearing my stained diner apron and hand him a thick wad of small bills. It was usually about $300. I would tell him it was everything I had managed to save that week. Robert would take the money without ever looking me in the eye. He never said thank you. He would just lick his thumb, count the bills slowly, sigh with dramatic disappointment, and slide the cash into his front pocket. He would look at me like I was a tragic mistake and say, "I guess every little bit helps when the economy is this bad. You just do not understand how hard it is to run a real business, Jessica." He never acknowledged how many hours on my aching feet that money represented. He never asked if I had enough money left over to buy my own groceries or pay my own rent. To him, my money was just a tiny, pathetic drop in the bucket of his massive financial problems. He made me feel like my contribution was useless, yet he gladly took the cash from my hands every single week. He believed I owed him for simply raising me. The entire dynamic in my family was completely built around appearances and social status. My mother, Susan, was obsessed with the social ladder at our large suburban church. For her, religion was not about faith or kindness or charity. It was a competitive sport. It was about who wore the nicest designer clothes to Sunday service, who drove the newest luxury vehicles into the church parking lot, and who sat in the best pews near the front. She treated our family reputation like a fragile glass sculpture that my very existence was constantly in danger of breaking. Susan was deeply ashamed of me. She would actually ask me to park my beat-up 15-year-old car a block away when I came to visit them. She told me she did not want her church friends driving by and seeing such an ugly vehicle in her pristine driveway. She treated me like an embarrassing secret she had to hide from polite society. Then there was my older sister, Ashley. She was the undisputed golden child of the family. Ashley never worked a difficult day in her entire life. She was handed everything on a silver platter from the day she was born. She married a man named Trent. Trent was a preppy, loudmouth real estate agent who spent far more time drinking scotch at the local country club than he did actually showing houses to clients. My parents absolutely adored Trent. They thought he was the ultimate success story, the perfect son-in-law they could brag about to their wealthy friends. They treated him like royalty. I will never forget one specific Sunday family dinner. I had just finished a brutal weekend shift at the diner. I rushed over to my parents' house because Susan insisted attendance was mandatory. I was still wearing my black non-slip work shoes and my plain gray uniform shirt. I walked into the formal dining room to find everyone drinking expensive imported wine and laughing loudly. Trent was wearing a designer cashmere sweater draped casually over his shoulders. Ashley was showing off a brand new diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light from the crystal chandelier. I sat down at the empty end of the table, feeling the physical exhaustion pulling at my bones. Trent looked across the mahogany table at me, swirled his red wine in his crystal glass, and smirked. He said, "Jessica, you always look so incredibly tired. Are you really still slinging hash browns and refilling coffee mugs at that sad little roadside diner? You know, if you had just stayed in community college and applied yourself, you might be able to afford a decent haircut by now. Maybe you could even buy a car that does not leak oil all over the street and embarrass your mother." Ashley laughed a high, mocking sound and covered her mouth to hide her grin. My mother just sighed heavily and shook her head, looking at me with total and complete embarrassment. She refused to meet my eyes. I looked at my father, hoping just once in my entire life he would speak up and defend me. I had just given him $300 in cash 2 days ago. Instead, Robert raised his wine glass to Trent, smiled proudly, and said, "Well, not everyone has your incredible business acumen, Trent. We cannot all be winners in this life. Someone has to pour the coffee and clean the tables for the successful people." They all laughed. The sound of their cruel laughter echoed in my ears, bouncing off the walls of the dining room I had helped pay the property taxes for. I just sat there. I kept my mouth tightly shut. I let them mock my uniform, my job, and my life. I nodded, apologized softly for looking like a mess, and quietly ate my dinner while they ignored me for the rest of the evening. I let them believe I was exactly what they said I was. I let them think I was uneducated. I let them think I was worthless. I let them believe I was a complete failure who would never amount to anything in the real world. What kept me quiet at dinners like that was not fear of Trent's jokes. It was habit. I had been trained to measure peace by how little space I occupied. If I defended myself, Susan called me dramatic. If I mentioned the money I gave Robert, he said I was keeping score. If I refused Ashley a favor, she told everyone I was jealous of her marriage. So I learned to absorb the insult, finish the meal, and leave without giving them anything they could turn into another family story about Jessica being difficult. The strange thing was that the more calmly I accepted their contempt, the more certain they became that their judgment of me was correct. My silence looked like weakness because they had never imagined it could also be discipline. But here is the cruel, beautiful truth that none of them knew. When the horrible dinner was finally over, I walked out to my terrible, rattling sedan. I drove across town to my apartment building. I walked inside and securely locked the deadbolt behind me. I stripped off the grease-stained diner uniform and threw it straight into the washing machine. I took a long, boiling hot shower and washed the smell of cheap coffee and fried food out of my hair. I scrubbed away the waitress persona until I was completely clean. Then I put on a pair of comfortable silk pajamas. I walked into my spare bedroom, which I kept permanently locked from the outside. I opened a heavy, fireproof, high-security safe hidden in the closet. Inside that safe was a top-of-the-line, highly encrypted laptop. I carried it over to my massive mahogany desk, opened the computer, and logged into my highly secure private network. I watched the screen light up with the complex financial dashboard of my company. I was not a community college dropout. That was the biggest lie of all. Years earlier, I had quietly finished my bachelor's degree in finance through an accredited online program while working around the diner schedule. I studied after midnight, took proctored exams on almost no sleep, completed the experience requirements, and earned my CPA license without telling anyone in my family. The professional recognition ceremony came later. The credential itself was already real and active. After that, I formed a limited liability company whose public-facing structure did not connect my day-to-day life to my family, and I built a virtual wealth management firm from the ground up. My clients were high-net-worth individuals, tech executives, and successful entrepreneurs from across the country. They knew the licensed professional and the firm they had hired. What they did not know, and had no reason to know, was that I still poured coffee at a highway diner under a life my family assumed was my only life. The firm was highly lucrative. I managed tens of millions of dollars in client assets, and my own investment accounts had made me a self-made millionaire before my 28th birthday. The waitress job was not a fraud on my clients or the government. It was camouflage aimed at one audience, only my family. So why did I play the part of the poor, struggling waitress? Why did I subject myself to the grease, the aching feet, and the constant humiliation from my terrible family? Because I knew exactly who they were. I knew that if my father ever found out I had real money, he would demand every single penny to save his failing construction business. He would feel entirely entitled to my hard-earned wealth. I knew my mother would relentlessly extort me to fund her church socialite lifestyle, demanding luxury cars and expensive vacations just so she could brag to her friends. I knew Trent and Ashley would expect me to bankroll their country club memberships and buy them designer clothes. They would drain me dry, take everything I had built, and then discard me without a second thought. Playing the part of the miserable failure was my armor. It was the only way to protect my wealth, my sanity, and my future from their insatiable greed. But I still had this terrible, lingering guilt deep inside my chest. Despite their cruelty, they were still my family. I could not bear the thought of my parents actually going bankrupt and losing the home I grew up in. So every single year, I logged into the county tax portal through a secure proxy server. I quietly paid my parents' property taxes in full, completely anonymously. I paid their overdue utility bills when they fell too far behind. I was secretly keeping a roof over the heads of the very people who openly mocked me at the dinner table. I kept records of every anonymous tax payment and utility payment, not because I expected gratitude, but because numbers were how I made sense of guilt. Each receipt told me the same story: I was capable of helping them without surrendering my entire life. I convinced myself that this arrangement was a boundary. In reality, it was a compromise that let me continue rescuing people who had never learned to respect me. I was protecting my wealth from their greed, while still feeding the belief that I was responsible for preventing every consequence they might face. That contradiction would matter later because Robert understood exactly where my strongest professional instincts became weakest. He knew the words family home could still override the part of me that normally read every contract twice. I thought I had the perfect system. I thought I could quietly protect them from ruin while protecting myself from their greed. I thought I was in complete control of the situation. I had no idea that my father and my arrogant brother-in-law were already setting a devastating trap that would attempt to completely destroy my life. Ashley pushed past my front door without even knocking. She dumped a massive leather weekend bag right in the middle of my small living room floor. Her 5-year-old son was already running toward my kitchen, knocking over a stack of mail on his way, and her 3-year-old daughter was pulling on the hem of her expensive silk blouse. Ashley did not even say hello or ask how I was doing. She just looked down at her glowing smartphone screen and sighed with intense irritation. She told me I needed to take the kids for the entire weekend because Trent had booked a surprise wine tasting trip to Napa Valley. She said they desperately needed a romantic getaway to relieve their stress from remodeling their sunroom. I stood there in shock, holding the plain black dress I had just picked up from the dry cleaners and keeping it away from my nephew's sticky hands as he tried to climb my television stand. I told Ashley I could not watch the kids that weekend. I reminded her that I had told both her and our mother 2 months earlier that this was the formal recognition ceremony for the accounting program that had led to my professional certification. My license was already active, but the ceremony was the one public moment I had allowed myself after years of studying alone. I was supposed to be at the downtown auditorium in 2 hours to walk across the stage and accept the credential packet with the other graduates. Ashley rolled her eyes so hard I thought they would get stuck in the back of her head. She crossed her arms and looked at my plain black dress with total disgust. She told me it was just a printed piece of paper from a random online program, and nobody even cared about it anyway. She said I was acting completely selfish by bringing it up. She complained that Trent had spent an absolute fortune on the luxury resort in Napa, and they would lose their massive deposit if they did not leave for the airport in the next 20 minutes. I tried to stand my ground. I stepped forward and told her this was the most important day of my professional life. I explained how I had worked 14-hour shifts at the diner and stayed awake until 4 in the morning studying tax law for years just to earn this specific credential. Before I could even finish my sentence, my cell phone rang loudly from the kitchen counter. It was my mother, Susan. Ashley had obviously called her from the car on the way over to complain about my anticipated resistance. I answered the phone and Susan immediately started yelling into my ear. Her voice was shrill, demanding, and utterly devoid of any warmth. She told me I was being a terrible, unsupportive sister. She said family always comes first, and my silly little internet classes were absolutely nothing compared to Ashley and Trent maintaining a healthy, successful marriage. Susan demanded that I cancel my ridiculous plans, step up to the plate, and do my mandatory duty as an aunt. She said if I ruined Ashley's expensive vacation over a fake graduation, I would not be welcome at the family Thanksgiving dinner next month. I slowly lowered the phone and looked at Ashley. She was standing in my living room with a triumphant, mocking smirk on her perfect face. Outside, Trent impatiently honked the horn of his pristine luxury sport utility vehicle. Ashley dropped the heavy diaper bag heavily onto my cheap sofa, kissed her children quickly on the top of their heads without actually making eye contact with them, and walked out the front door without ever saying thank you. She left me standing completely alone with a crying toddler pulling at my jeans and a 5-year-old who was already throwing his hard plastic toy trucks directly at my apartment walls. I carefully folded my black dress and put it back in the closet, burying my resentment under layers of duty. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning spilled apple juice, wiping sticky handprints off my walls, and making boxed macaroni and cheese. When the ceremony began, I sat on my faded couch, with my encrypted laptop open on my knees, and watched the live stream through a weak connection. The dean called my name clearly over the speakers. For a few seconds, the camera showed the empty space where I should have been walking. There was no applause from my family, no flowers waiting in the lobby, and no photograph of me holding the credential I had earned. There was only my nephew shouting from the hallway because I had turned off his cartoon for 10 minutes. I saved the live stream recording to a private folder before closing the computer. The accomplishment still existed, even if nobody in my family witnessed it. What hurt was not missing a piece of paper. What hurt was realizing how easily they could make my milestones disappear whenever Ashley wanted something. Even then, I told myself the sacrifice was worth it to keep the peace. I still believed that if I gave enough, surrendered enough, and made myself convenient enough, they might eventually look at me with pride. That night, after Ashley finally returned from Napa and collected the children, she did not ask whether I had watched the ceremony. She talked for 10 minutes about the vineyard, the resort, and a bottle of wine Trent had bought then left. I stood in the doorway after her car disappeared and realized I had not told her the dean called my name. Part of me wanted to text the family group and send them a screenshot of the empty stage. I did not. I already knew what they would say, that I was making everyone feel guilty over something small. So I locked the screenshot in the same private folder as the rest of my professional life and went to bed before my next diner shift. The decision seemed minor then. In hindsight, it was another lesson in how thoroughly I had learned to hide the parts of myself that deserved celebration. That desperate, pathetic desire for their love was exactly what my father exploited 3 weeks later. My cell phone rang right in the middle of a chaotic lunch rush at the diner. Robert told me I needed to come to his construction supply warehouse immediately. He sounded genuinely panicked. His voice was shaking violently over the line, and he kept clearing his throat like he could barely breathe. I quickly asked my manager to cover my section and rushed over to his office, my heart pounding with genuine fear for his safety. When I walked through the heavy metal warehouse door, the room was a complete disaster. Heavy steel filing cabinet drawers were pulled wide open, and loose financial papers were scattered all across his scarred wooden desk. Robert was pacing frantically back and forth across the dirty, scuffed linoleum floor. He looked pale, disheveled, and completely exhausted. He ran his calloused hands roughly through his thinning gray hair and collapsed heavily into his creaking leather desk chair. I stepped carefully over a pile of discarded envelopes and asked him what was wrong. He looked up at me with thick tears pooling in his eyes. It was a masterful, devastating performance. He told me the terrible economy had finally crushed his business for good. He said his largest commercial contractor had defaulted on a massive supply payment, and now the bank was aggressively threatening to foreclose on the family home. He told me he and Susan were going to lose the house they had lived in for 30 years by the end of the month. He pointed a trembling finger to a stack of bright red warning letters sitting on the edge of his desk. He said they only had 48 hours to come up with $10,000, or the bank would officially begin the physical eviction process. I stood there in my cheap, grease-stained diner uniform and felt a sharp, heavy ache in my chest. $10,000 was absolutely nothing to me. I had millions of dollars sitting safely in my highly encrypted, anonymous wealth management accounts. I could have pulled out my checkbook and written him a check right then and there without ever missing a single cent. But I knew I could not do that. If I handed him $10,000 in cash, my entire protective cover would be instantly blown. He would immediately demand to know where a struggling roadside waitress got that kind of money. He would ruthlessly uncover my wealth management firm, and the endless aggressive extortion from my entire family would completely destroy my peaceful life. I asked him how I could possibly help him save the house when I barely made minimum wage plus tips. Robert leaned forward across the desk and grabbed my hands. His grip was tight, urgent, and desperate. He told me he had spoken to a private, independent commercial lender earlier that morning. He said the lender was willing to give him a short-term emergency business loan for exactly $10,000 to cover the immediate mortgage deficit and stop the foreclosure. But there was a massive catch. Because Robert had defaulted on so many credit cards and business lines over the past 5 years, his credit score was completely destroyed. The private lender required a cosigner with a pristine, absolutely clean financial history to secure the funds. Robert looked at me with those pleading, desperate eyes. He told me I was the only person left in the entire world who could save the family from total ruin. He said Ashley and Trent absolutely could not help because they were tying up all their liquid capital in a massive new real estate venture and could not risk a credit inquiry. He said my credit score was absolutely perfect because I had never taken out a major loan, never bought a new car, and never carried a high credit card balance. He begged me to just sign my name on the dotted line. He promised he would pay the entire loan back in exactly 6 months once his lucrative winter construction contracts cleared the bank. He swore on his life that this signature would never negatively affect me. I hesitated, pulling my hands back slightly. Every logical, highly trained instinct in my brain screamed at me to walk away from the desk. But then Robert did something he had not done since I was a little girl in elementary school. He stood up, walked around the clutter of the desk, and pulled me into a tight, warm hug. He held me closely against his chest and told me he was so incredibly proud of me. He said he always knew he could count on his youngest daughter when times got truly hard. He told me I was the silent, strong backbone of the entire family. It was exactly what I had spent my entire life starving to hear. I was so completely blinded by the sudden, overwhelming warmth of his rare affection that I completely ignored all my rigorous professional financial training. I nodded slowly against his shoulder and told him I would do it. I told him I would gladly sign the legal papers to save their home from the bank. Robert instantly pulled away from the hug. The warmth vanished from his eyes in a single terrifying second, immediately replaced by a sharp, calculating, cold business focus. He turned his back to me, reached into his locked top desk drawer, and pulled out a thick stack of complex legal documents. They were folded back deliberately and aggressively. The top pages outlining the terms were completely covered by a heavy manila folder, exposing only the bottom signature lines marked with bright yellow sticky tabs. I reached my hand out to physically flip the pages back so I could read the terms and conditions of the loan. I was a licensed, certified public accountant. I knew better than to sign a blind financial document without reviewing the principal and interest rates. But Robert slammed his large, heavy hand down hard on top of the pages, pinning them firmly to the desk. He let out a harsh, irritated sigh that echoed loudly in the quiet warehouse office. He told me the legal notary was waiting impatiently in the front lobby, and they were already running dangerously late. He said if I took 30 minutes to read all the boring legal jargon and standard banking clauses, the bank would officially close for the weekend, and they would lose the house forever. He shoved a heavy black ink pen forcefully into my right hand. He looked down at me with an expression of deep, wounded disappointment and asked if I really thought my own father would try to trick his youngest daughter. He asked if I was calling him a liar to his face after everything he had done to raise me. The heavy, suffocating guilt washed over me instantly. I gripped the pen tightly until my knuckles turned white. My hand shook violently as I quickly scribbled my name on 3 different signature lines, pressing the ink hard into the paper. I did not see the total loan amount. I did not see the repayment terms. I only saw the bottom of the pages and the yellow tabs. I gave him my signature because I loved him. I gave him my signature because I desperately wanted to belong to the family. Even before I left the warehouse, a thin line of doubt kept scraping at the back of my mind. The document stack had been too thick for the small emergency loan Robert described, and his sudden impatience had been too sharp. I almost turned around. I almost asked him to give me copies before anything was submitted. Then I heard his earlier words in my head, "Proud of you, backbone of the family." That was how manipulation worked with Robert. He did not need to overpower my intelligence. He only needed to reach the part of me that still wanted a father's approval. I drove back to the diner, telling myself that the uneasiness was professional paranoia. I would spend the next 3 weeks learning that it had been the most accurate instinct in the room. The very moment the ink dried on the final signature page, Robert aggressively snatched the documents away from me. He quickly shoved them back into the thick manila folder and tucked them securely under his arm like a prized trophy. He did not say thank you. He did not offer me another hug. He simply looked down at me in my stained, cheap waitress uniform, reached out his hand and patted the top of my head condescendingly like I was a foolish, obedient dog. A slow, arrogant, chilling smirk spread completely across his face. He looked me right in the eyes and told me, well, at least your credit is good for something. He turned around and walked straight out of the office, leaving me standing completely alone in the dusty, quiet warehouse. I felt a cold, terrifying chill settle deep into my bones. I did not know it yet, but that desperate signature had just sealed my fate. Exactly 3 weeks after I signed those blind documents in the dusty warehouse, the heavy metal door of my apartment mailbox jammed tightly against its frame. I had to grip the small brass key with both hands and yank aggressively to pry the rusted panel open. A thick envelope slid out and hit the damp concrete walkway near my boots. The return address was printed in stark black ink. It was from the Internal Revenue Service. I tore the thick envelope open in the parking lot while the wind tugged at the pages. It was an IRS discrepancy notice tied to filings associated with my Social Security number. The problem was not that the government thought a waitress was suddenly rich. My legitimate business income was already properly reported through the structures my accountant and I used. The problem was that new corporate reporting and debt-related information had appeared under my identity that did not match any return, entity guarantee, or filing I had authorized. The notice referenced a substantial liability and documentation connected to a transaction I had never disclosed because I had never made it. I read the processing dates twice, then compared them with the day I had signed the supposed $10,000 emergency loan for my father. The dates matched. That was the first objective sign that my signature had been used for something far larger than Robert had described. I ran up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter, and drove straight to my parents' house. I did not bother to call ahead. I pulled into their driveway, threw my car into park, and marched directly through the side gate into their backyard. I found Robert standing casually on the freshly mowed grass. He was humming a cheerful tune and meticulously cleaning his expensive golf clubs with a damp microfiber rag. He looked completely relaxed, entirely unbothered by the supposed total financial ruin he had cried about in his office just 21 days ago. I walked right up to him and shoved the crumpled IRS letter directly into his line of sight. I demanded to know what he had done with my Social Security number. I asked him how a simple $10,000 short-term business loan could instantly generate a federal tax warning of this massive magnitude. Robert did not jump. He did not drop his golf club. He simply wiped a speck of dirt off his shiny iron driver, slowly turned his head, and squinted at the paper in my trembling hand. He snatched the letter roughly from my grip. He barely glanced at the terrifying financial numbers printed on the second page before folding the paper in half and handing it right back to me. He chuckled a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest. He looked at me with an expression of total patronizing amusement. He said it was just a clerical error and waved his large hand in the air like he was swatting away a minor annoying insect. I stepped closer and pushed back aggressively. I pointed to the specific tax code violations listed on the page. I raised my voice and told him the federal government does not make clerical errors regarding sudden massive corporate debt assigned to a young waitress. I demanded he call the private lender right then and there to prove the exact terms of the contract I had blindly signed. Robert stopped smiling. His physical presence shifted from relaxed to immediately intimidating. He dropped the golf club onto the grass, stepped directly into my personal space, and crossed his thick arms tightly over his chest. He looked down his nose at me, and his voice turned sharp and incredibly cold. He told me I was acting hysterical and overreacting over a standard banking delay. He laughed again, louder and much crueler this time. He told me not to hurt my brain over it, sweetheart. He said Trent had a brilliant private accountant who was currently handling all the complicated back-office paperwork. He mocked my lack of formal education right to my face. He told me to stick to pouring hot coffee and wiping down sticky tables and leave the high-level corporate banking logistics to the real businessmen who actually understood how capital markets functioned. He refused to answer a single direct question about the loan amount. He bent down, picked up his golf club, turned his back to me completely, and walked straight into the house. He slid the heavy glass patio door shut and locked it firmly behind him, leaving me standing alone on the lawn holding a federal warning letter. My gut screamed at me that something was fundamentally and dangerously wrong. Every professional instinct I possessed warned me that a massive financial crime was actively occurring, but the true devastating scope of the disaster did not reveal itself until the following Sunday afternoon. Susan sent a mandatory group text to my phone commanding everyone to attend a special family celebration lunch. She included an address I did not recognize. I typed the destination into my navigation system and drove my rattling sedan across the city. The route took me far away from my parents' modest suburban neighborhood and directed me toward an exclusive, highly restricted gated community on the absolute wealthiest edge of town. I pulled up to a massive stone security booth. A uniformed guard stepped out holding a clipboard. I lowered my window and gave him my name. He checked his list, gave my rusted car a long look of obvious disdain, and pressed a button to open the heavy wrought iron gates. I drove slowly down a winding, perfectly paved private road lined with ancient oak trees and manicured hedges. I finally pulled into a sweeping circular driveway. The property in front of me was a sprawling, immaculate custom-built estate. It had towering white columns framing the entrance, a slate tile roof, and a 3-car garage. Trent and Ashley had just bought a $1.2 million home. I parked my old car near the back of the driveway, completely dwarfed by Trent's brand-new luxury sport utility vehicle. I walked up the wide brick steps and pushed open the massive double front doors. The foyer was absolutely breathtaking. It featured a sweeping hardwood staircase, towering vaulted ceilings, and a brilliant crystal chandelier that caught the afternoon sunlight. Ashley was standing in the grand entryway wearing a brand-new designer silk outfit and expensive leather shoes. She was pouring premium imported champagne into tall fluted glasses for my parents. She squealed loudly when she saw me, grabbed my arm, and aggressively dragged me on a relentless tour of the property. She showed me the custom marble countertops in the enormous chef kitchen, the private home theater room in the finished basement, and the massive walk-in closets in the master bedroom. She bragged endlessly about how much everything cost. She pointed out the imported Italian tile in the master bathroom and proudly announced that Trent had paid for the entire house with a massive, brilliant lump sum down payment. I stood in the center of her gleaming new living room, feeling a cold sweat break out across my entire body. I asked Ashley how they could possibly afford a sudden, massive down payment of that size when Trent had only sold 2 minor commercial properties the entire calendar year. Trent walked into the room right at that moment, holding a crystal glass of top-shelf bourbon. He interrupted my question, stepping directly into my personal space with a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and bragged loudly about leveraging aggressive capital markets. He threw around complex financial buzzwords, claiming he had recently secured elite private funding that regular uneducated people like me would never be able to comprehend. He patted his own chest and proudly announced that his latest investments were yielding unprecedented cash returns. I looked across the vast living room and watched my father. Robert was sinking deeply into a plush custom leather sofa. He gladly accepted a fresh pour of expensive bourbon from Trent, smiling wider and looking more relaxed than I had seen him look in 10 years. Just minutes later, Susan walked over and admired a very expensive modern art painting hanging on the wall. Robert took a sip of his drink and began loudly complaining to Susan about the rising price of regular gasoline. He shook his head sadly and claimed his construction supply business was still completely underwater. He put on a pathetic, dramatic tone and told my mother he barely had enough money left in his checking account to keep the warehouse lights turned on for another month. The physical reality of the room violently clashed with the absolute lies I was being told. The sheer dissonance was deafening. Robert was sitting in a millionaire estate, drinking $50 a glass bourbon, while claiming he was completely bankrupt and moments away from losing his own home. Trent was loudly bragging about making brilliant, massive real estate investments with unlimited capital, despite the entire family knowing the housing market was terrible and his commission checks were practically non-existent. and I was standing quietly in the corner, hiding a devastating IRS discrepancy notice tied directly to my Social Security number in my purse. My heart hammered brutally against my ribs. I watched Trent clap Robert firmly on the shoulder. I watched the two men exchange a very specific, deeply secretive and victorious look. I watched my father nod slowly in response to whatever silent message Trent had just conveyed. The heavy, sickening realization crashed over me like a physical blow. They were not two separate financial situations. Robert and Trent were actively working together. I stood in the middle of that pristine $1.2 million home, surrounded by expensive furniture and imported marble, and the agonizing truth settled into the very pit of my stomach. I was the one paying for all of this. I did not know the exact mechanical details yet, but my professional instincts were screaming that the blind signature I had given to save my parents' house had been weaponized to buy my sister a mansion. I began looking at the mansion the way I would look at a client's suspicious transaction, not as a symbol, but as a collection of facts. The timing of the purchase, the size of the down payment Ashley had bragged about, Trent's weak sales record, Robert's claim of imminent foreclosure, the IRS notice in my purse. None of those facts proved the whole scheme by itself, but together they formed a pattern that demanded restraint. If I confronted them before I knew the mechanism, they would delete emails, change passwords, move money, and agree on a cleaner story. So I memorized what I could see. I listened when Trent talked about funding. I watched Robert's face whenever money came up. I left that house carrying no documents, but I carried something almost as useful, the certainty that the contradiction was real. The anxiety built into a crushing, suffocating pressure inside my chest. I felt lightheaded and completely dizzy. I gripped the edge of the smooth marble kitchen island just to keep my hands from visibly shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to empty my purse, throw the federal warning letter directly onto their pristine glass coffee table, and demand the absolute truth in front of everyone. But I forced myself to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I held my tongue. I forced a polite, empty smile onto my face and congratulated Ashley on her beautiful new home. I knew that if I tipped my hand now, they would instantly cover their tracks and hide the paper trail before I could prove what they had done. I nodded, quietly took a small sip of water, and began quietly planning my next move. Just 3 days after that suffocating house tour, my cell phone rang with a loud and demanding tone. It was my father. He did not say hello or ask how my shift at the diner had been. He immediately started complaining loudly into the receiver that his expensive desktop computer was completely frozen and he needed me to come over and fix it right now. I told him I had just finished a brutal 14-hour workday and my feet were aching, but he quickly cut me off. He said I owed him a simple favor for all the expensive food he bought for me when I was a child. He demanded I drive over to the house immediately because he had important business emails to read. I gripped my steering wheel, took a deep and heavy breath to calm my rising frustration, and turned my rattling car around to head toward his suburban neighborhood. I walked through the unlocked front door of my parents' house and found Robert sitting comfortably in his plush recliner in the living room. I was intensely watching a professional golf tournament on his massive flat-screen television. He did not even look up at me when I walked inside. He just pointed a lazy, calloused finger toward his home office down the narrow hallway and told me the computer screen was stuck on some annoying loading page. He commanded me to reboot the entire system and fix whatever terrible computer virus I had probably caused by using his internet connection the last time I visited. I did not bother to argue with his completely illogical accusation. I simply turned away, walked down the carpeted hallway, and stepped into his cluttered and dark home office. The desktop monitor was glaring brightly in the dim room, casting a harsh blue light across his messy wooden desk. The computer was indeed completely locked up, stuck permanently on a frozen web browser page that would not respond to the mouse or the keyboard. I sat down in his heavy leather office chair and pressed the physical power button on the computer tower. I held the button down firmly until the machine forcefully shut off and the screen went totally black. I waited exactly 10 seconds in the quiet room. Then I pressed the power button again and listened to the loud whirring sound of the internal cooling fans spinning back to life. The operating system slowly booted up. The main login screen appeared. Robert had never believed in basic cybersecurity. He never used a password for his primary administrative account because he claimed passwords were too hard to remember. I simply clicked his name and the main desktop screen loaded immediately. As the startup programs automatically launched, his default internet browser opened directly to his private email account. He had left the browser configured to remember his login credentials and automatically restore his previous internet sessions. I reached out to grab the mouse, fully intending to close the window so I could run a basic diagnostic software scan on his hard drive. But before my finger could press the left mouse button, a specific yellow folder located on the left side of his email client caught my immediate attention. My hand froze completely still in midair. The digital folder was deliberately labeled Retirement and Equity Transfer. The title made absolutely no sense to me. Robert had spent the last 5 years constantly claiming he was completely bankrupt and totally incapable of ever retiring. He had literally just cried real tears in his dusty warehouse office about losing this exact suburban house to imminent bank foreclosure. My heart began to pound a heavy, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I thought about the massive luxury mansion Trent and Ashley had just successfully purchased. I thought about the terrifying federal tax discrepancy notice currently sitting securely in my purse. My professional financial instincts took over entirely. I ignored the deep sense of privacy invasion, moved the mouse cursor directly over the folder, and clicked the button twice. The folder contained dozens of highly sensitive financial documents and scanned PDF attachments. I opened the very first attachment located at the top of the list. It was a formal bank loan origination document from a major national corporate lender. I leaned much closer to the glowing monitor and rapidly scanned the dense legal text. This was clearly not the simple $10,000 short-term business contract I had blindly signed in his warehouse. My eyes darted to the top right corner of the digital page. The document was an official application for a massive home equity line of credit. The total principal loan amount listed in bold black ink was exactly $400,000. I stopped breathing. I scrolled to the signature pages and saw my name exactly where it should never have been. The document was a $400,000 home equity line of credit secured by my parents' house with Robert, using the property as collateral, and my identity inserted as the high credit co-borrower and guarantor needed to obtain approval. The signature image was mine, but the document surrounding it was not. Robert and Trent had taken the pages I signed under pressure in the warehouse and attached my signature block to a different set of loan terms. The notarial certification had been completed through a dubious online service that did not match the circumstances I remembered. My pristine credit history had been used to help drain $400,000 of equity from the family home. I opened the next attachment. It was a wire transfer confirmation showing the exact sum of $400,000 moving from the HELOC proceeds into a holding account controlled by Trent's real estate company. The pieces locked together with brutal clarity. The stolen equity had supplied the enormous down payment on the $1.2 million mansion Ashley had just shown me. The rest of the house was financed separately, but the transaction could not have closed without that $400,000 infusion. My name and credit had been placed on the HELOC, so the lender could pursue me if the account defaulted. Robert and Trent had not simply lied about a $10,000 rescue loan. They had used my signature to obtain 10 times $40,000, routed the money to Trent, and positioned me as the person on paper who could be blamed when repayment failed. My entire body was shaking so violently that the heavy leather office chair rattled loudly against the wooden desk. I felt physically sick to my stomach, like I was going to throw up right there on his carpet. I reached for the mouse again, desperate to find even more evidence of their crime. I clicked on a file located near the very bottom of the folder. It was a saved digital transcript from a mobile group messaging application. I opened the text file and saw a long history of private conversations between Robert, Susan, Ashley, and Trent. I scrolled rapidly through the messages, my eyes scanning the cruel, calculating words of my own family. The most recent message was sent by my father just 2 days ago. I read the exact text on the screen and the words burned themselves permanently into my memory. Robert had written, "The equity cleared. Trent's new house is funded. We announce my retirement next month. When the bank comes for the HELOC, the waitress will have to take the fall. She does not have the brains or the lawyers to fight it." I kept reading the horrific transcript, unable to look away from the glowing screen. Susan had replied immediately with a smiling face icon. She wrote that it was about time I finally contributed something useful to the family after being such a terrible financial disappointment for my entire life. Ashley had chimed in next, typing that I would probably just declare bankruptcy and keep pouring cheap coffee anyway, so it really did not matter if my credit was permanently destroyed. Trent ended the conversation by writing that the plan was absolutely flawless because poor people never know how to navigate complex corporate legal systems. I sat completely alone in the dim glow of the computer monitor. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal washed over me in a dark, suffocating wave. They had not just stolen money, they had systematically plotted to completely destroy my life. They planned to throw me to the authorities and let me face massive debt collection and potential prison time for fraudulent borrowing, all so they could live in luxury and pretend to be wealthy socialites. For 29 years, I had desperately craved their love and their approval. I had endured their relentless mockery, their cruel jokes, and their constant emotional extortion just to keep the family intact. I had secretly paid their property taxes to keep a roof over their heads, while they actively plotted to ruin my future. The profound, aching devastation inside my chest vanished instantly. The pain completely evaporated from my body. In its place, a brilliant, ice-cold, terrifying fury ignited in the very center of my soul. I did not cry a single tear. I did not feel sad or rejected. I felt powerful. I felt incredibly dangerous. They thought they were dealing with an uneducated, foolish diner waitress who would simply roll over and accept a lifetime of crushing federal debt. They had absolutely no idea that they had just committed felony financial fraud against a highly trained, certified public accountant who successfully managed tens of millions of dollars in corporate wealth for a living. I moved with absolute silent precision. I opened a new private browser tab and navigated directly to my highly secure, heavily encrypted private server. I attached every single document from the yellow folder to a direct file transfer. I meticulously uploaded the forged loan origination papers, the fake notary stamps, the wire transfer confirmation receipts showing the money moving to Trent's corporate account, and the complete unedited transcript of their cruel group chat. I watched the progress bar load across the screen and verified that every single file had successfully transferred to my private database. I double-checked the encryption protocols to ensure the evidence was completely locked down and untouchable by anyone else. Once the transfer was completely finished, I carefully closed my secure browser tab. I systematically cleared the internet cache and wiped any digital trace of my activity from the local machine. I closed the email folder exactly as I had found it. I closed the main email client and restored the desktop to its original state. I opened a generic internet news page and deliberately left it running in the background to make the computer look completely normal. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, smoothed out the wrinkles in my plain gray waitress uniform, and took one final slow breath to completely steady my racing heart. I walked out of the dark home office and stepped back into the bright living room. Robert was still sitting comfortably in his recliner, his eyes glued to the golf tournament on the television screen. I told him the computer was completely fixed, and he just needed to run a basic software update later that evening. He grunted loudly, took a sip of his cold beer, and waved me away with his hand, without even turning his head to look at me. He did not say thank you. He just told me to make sure I locked the front door on my way out, so I did not let a cold draft into the house. Before starting the car, I sent myself a short encrypted note listing exactly what I had copied and the time I had copied it. I was not trying to create evidence by narration. I wanted a contemporaneous record, so I would not later blur one document into another under stress. I wrote forged HELOC $400,000, wire to Trent's company, notary record, family group chat. Then I locked the note. That small act steadied me. Robert had relied on confusion and shame. My answer would be chronology. I would separate what I knew from what I suspected, and I would refuse to accuse anyone of something I could not document. The fury was still there, but it had a shape now. I walked out of the house, stepped off the front porch, and walked steadily toward my rusted sedan. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and stared back at the suburban house I had spent my entire life trying to save. My father and my brother-in-law thought they had designed the perfect financial crime. They thought they could easily sacrifice my freedom to fund their lavish lifestyle. But as I started my engine and drove away from their pristine neighborhood, my mind was already shifting into a brutal, calculated overdrive. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate finance and legal warfare. I was going to gladly show them exactly how a real professional plays the game, and I was going to completely dismantle their entire world brick by stolen brick. I bypassed my kitchen entirely, marched down the narrow hallway of my apartment, and spun the heavy brass dial on my fireproof safe. I pulled out my high-security laptop, carried it to my mahogany desk, and immediately booted up my professional financial investigation software. I did not shed a single tear. I did not waste 1 ounce of energy screaming into a pillow or punching a wall. Anger is a completely useless emotion unless you forge it into a weapon. I was a licensed, certified public accountant who managed complex wealth portfolios for corporate executives. I knew exactly how to track stolen money, and I was about to turn my elite forensic auditing skills directly onto my own family. I logged into a premium restricted financial database that everyday consumers do not even know exists. I bypassed the standard free credit report websites and pulled my comprehensive, unfiltered institutional credit file using my Social Security number. I hit the print command. The heavy laser printer on the edge of my desk sprang to life. It did not print just 3 or 4 pages of standard history. It printed 42 pages of dense, itemized financial data. I stood over the output tray, watching page after page slide out, and the sheer scale of their criminal enterprise began to materialize right in front of my eyes. I grabbed a thick red marker and began pinning the pages to the large corkboard hanging on my office wall. I started with the unsecured debt. Robert and Trent had not just stolen the equity out of the family home. They had systematically opened 7 different premium credit cards in my name over the past 14 months. I traced the approval dates. They perfectly coincided with the exact weeks I had visited my parents' house to fix their internet router or set up my mother's new smartphone. Robert had clearly copied my driver license, my birth certificate, and my old tax returns from the filing cabinet in his garage to bypass the secondary security verification questions. I looked closely at the billing addresses attached to these fraudulent credit cards. They were not registered to my apartment, and they were not registered to my parents' suburban house. Trent had opened a commercial post office box on the wealthy side of town under a fake business name associated with my Social Security number. He had routed all the physical mail, all the warning letters, and all the monthly statements directly to that secure box so I would never see a single piece of paper. I ran my red marker down the itemized transaction histories of the maxed-out credit cards. The charges told a sickening, crystal-clear story of exactly how my sister and her husband were funding their lavish country club lifestyle. I saw thousands of dollars charged at luxury automotive dealerships for the down payment on Trent's pristine sport utility vehicle. I circled massive charges at high-end designer boutiques, expensive day spas, and fine dining restaurants. Ashley was literally swiping a piece of plastic with my stolen identity to buy her imported silk blouses and diamond tennis bracelets. Even my father had used the stolen funds. I found recurring monthly charges for Robert's exclusive golf course fees and expensive imported cigars. They had completely drained over $80,000 in unsecured credit, and every single dime was legally attached to my name. I called the fraud department of the primary credit card issuer and asked for a senior security representative. I verified my identity, explained that I had discovered multiple accounts I had never opened, and asked that the institution preserve every application record device, log statement, and access record connected to the accounts. I did not try to run my own sting by encouraging more spending. I wanted the evidence frozen in place before anyone in my family learned I was investigating. The representative placed a fraud restriction on new activity that required enhanced verification and opened a formal identity theft case. I requested copies of the account opening records and the available login metadata through the secure portal, so my attorney and law enforcement could later authenticate them properly. The records arrived through the secure portal later that evening. One set of account access logs pointed back to the residential internet service used at Trent and Ashley's previous rental home. I printed the metadata and pinned it beside the fraudulent statements, careful to note what it proved and what it did not. An IP address alone was not a conviction, but combined with the billing address, the timing, the transaction history, and the documents from Robert's computer, I tied the applications to the same people already discussing the scheme in writing. The value was in the pattern, each piece independently supported the next. I built a table on my screen with 5 columns: date account, action source document, and person connected to it. The HELOC sat at the top. Beneath it came the wire transfer, the mansion, closing the credit card openings, and the luxury charges. Each row linked back to something I had saved. The exercise stripped away the emotional noise. Ashley's bracelet was no longer just an insult glittering under a chandelier. It was a transaction on an account opened without my consent. Robert's golf fees were no longer proof that he was selfish. They were charges on fraudulent credit. Trent's bragging was no longer merely obnoxious. It was inconsistent with his company's legitimate revenue. By midnight, the board on my wall did not look like a family betrayal anymore. It looked like an audit file. But the credit cards were just the appetizers. I needed to understand the mechanics of the main course. I pulled up the Washington State Secretary of State Corporate Registry database. I typed in the exact name of Trent's supposed real estate investment firm. The search results loaded instantly, and the corporate shell game they were playing was pathetic and amateurish. Trent was not a successful real estate mogul. According to the public tax filings and commercial registry data, his limited liability company had not successfully closed a single legitimate real estate transaction in over 2 years. His business generated absolutely zero organic revenue. The entire operation was a complete mirage. He was using the $400,000 of stolen home equity from the forged loan to artificially inflate his corporate accounts. He would transfer the stolen loan money into his business checking account, label it as investment revenue, and then pay himself a massive executive salary. He was literally laundering my stolen identity through a fake real estate firm to make himself look like a brilliant, successful entrepreneur to my parents and their wealthy church friends. I dug into the property records for the new $1.2 million mansion Ashley had so proudly shown me. Trent had not used a traditional mortgage to buy that house. He had used the laundered equity money as a massive cash down payment and then structured the remaining balance through a shady private trust fund. He had specifically designed the purchase to completely shield the physical property from any future personal liability. He knew that when his financial house of cards finally collapsed, the lenders would not be able to easily seize the new mansion because it was hidden behind layers of corporate protection. I paced back and forth across my home office, my mind processing the raw data at lightning speed. Something was still missing. A $400,000 HELOC normally requires scheduled payments or interest servicing. If they had taken out this loan 3 months ago, the bank should have already started demanding payment. If they missed the payments, the bank would have sent aggressive default notices to my actual apartment because the primary loan was tied to my active Social Security number. But I had not received any bills until that single IRS tax discrepancy notice arrived in my mailbox. I sat back down and pulled up the original forged loan origination documents I had copied from Robert's computer. I zoomed in on the fine print buried deep in the 34th page of the HELOC agreement. I read the specific repayment terms and the blood completely froze in my veins. I returned to the forged HELOC agreement and read the repayment section line by line. The document did not become a different kind of loan simply because the terms were aggressive. It remained the $400,000 HELOC identified in Robert's files. What made it dangerous was a promotional draw and defer structure buried in the agreement. For the first 120 days after the advance scheduled payments were deferred while interest accrued. At the end of that period, the account required a substantial catch-up payment and moved immediately into default remedies if the required amount was not received. The interest rate and default penalties were punishing. Robert and Trent had chosen terms that kept the lender quiet long enough for them to move the money and stage Robert's retirement celebration, then left the consequences attached to the identity they had inserted into the contract mine. I looked at the date the forged contract was officially funded. I opened the calendar application on my computer monitor and counted forward exactly 120 days. My finger hovered over the screen as I landed on the exact date the massive balloon payment was due to the lender. The payment was due on a Tuesday. It was exactly 24 hours after my father's massive country club retirement party. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their master plan hit me like a physical punch to the throat. The entire timeline had been meticulously and deliberately engineered from the very beginning. The retirement party was not a celebration of a long, successful career. It was a grand theatrical exit strategy. I grabbed my red marker and began furiously drawing timelines on the corkboard, connecting the dates with thick, angry lines. Robert knew his construction supply business was completely dead. I knew the original suburban family home was underwater. so he and Trent forged my signature to extract every single remaining drop of cash out of the property. They funneled the cash into Trent's hidden corporate accounts to buy the new mansion and fund their luxury lifestyles. They had no intention of curing the HELOC when the deferred period ended. The 120-day structure gave them a silent window in which to move the proceeds, finish the mansion purchase, spend through the fraudulent cards, and prepare Robert's public retirement announcement. The lender would not need to know their private motive. All it would see after the deadline was a defaulted $400,000 home equity obligation, supported by documents carrying my identity. On the Monday of the retirement party, Robert would stand in front of his wealthy friends, his church elders, and his business partners. He would declare himself a massive success and announce he was officially closing his construction firm to enjoy his golden years. He would bask in their applause and admiration. Then Tuesday morning would arrive. The HELOC's deferred payment period would end, the required payment would fail, and the lender's collection and fraud review procedures would begin. The account records would show a loan secured by my parents' home proceeds routed into Trent's company, and my name sitting inside a transaction I had never knowingly authorized. Robert and Trent were counting on that paper trail pointing toward me long enough for them to deny responsibility. They had built the documents so I would appear to be the financially responsible party who had agreed to the debt while they posed as shocked relatives. Collectors and investigators would start with the signed documents, my Social Security number, and the destination of the money. Without the files I had copied from Robert's computer, the group chat, and the access logs, I could have spent months trying to prove that the signature pages had been repurposed. The danger was not that an investigator would automatically assume guilt because I worked at a diner. The danger was that documentary evidence had been manufactured to make a sophisticated fraud look voluntary. Until I broke that paper trail apart, my professional reputation, my credit, and potentially my freedom were all exposed. My parents and my sister had already rehearsed the story they intended to tell. The group chat made that clear. They would say they knew nothing about the loan, that I had always been unstable with money, and that I must have created the problem myself. Robert could claim I had misused information connected to his house. Trent could deny knowing how the funds entered his company. If investigators accepted even part of that story before seeing the hidden communications, I could face a serious fraud investigation and years of legal damage while they lived behind the walls of the mansion my stolen identity had helped finance. They were willing to risk my career and my liberty because they believed I lacked the education and resources to fight back. I also understood why the retirement party mattered to them psychologically. Robert wanted the room full before the consequences arrived. He wanted the pastor, the bank president, the business partners, and the country club friends to see him as successful one final time. The celebration was supposed to become social evidence that his version of reality was true. If the loan trouble surfaced the next day, he could point backward to a room of respectable witnesses who had applauded his integrity. That was why I decided not to derail the party early. I was not interested in embarrassing him for entertainment. I needed the legal process ready first. But if he insisted on turning his reputation into a shield in front of a crowd, then the truth would have to reach that same crowd. I dropped the red marker onto my desk. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. I stood perfectly still, tracking logs, the forged property deeds, and the terrifying timeline pinned to my wall. They had spent months digging a deep, dark grave, and they fully intended to push me inside and bury me alive. I picked up my cell phone. I did not begin by confronting my family or trying to explain a complex financial case to the first patrol officer available. I had 12 days before the retirement party, and I needed the evidence preserved correctly. I opened my encrypted contact list and found Thomas Bradley, a high-profile corporate litigator I had worked with during a merger 2 years earlier. His practice centered on financial fraud, asset disputes, and emergency injunctions. If anyone could turn my private forensic work into admissible evidence without tipping off Robert and Trent, it was Thomas. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. When he answered, I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I needed to completely destroy a criminal financial syndicate, and I needed to execute the strike in exactly 12 days. I told him I had the entire paper trail, the digital access logs, and the forged commercial contracts ready for immediate review by investigators. He asked me who the targets were. I looked at the smiling family photo sitting on the edge of my desk, a picture taken years ago when I still foolishly believed they might eventually love me. I reached out, picked up the silver frame, and dropped it straight into the metal trash can by my feet. The glass shattered with a sharp, satisfying crack. I held the phone to my ear, stared at the timeline on my wall, and told the attorney exactly who we were going to destroy. Thomas Bradley cleared his throat on the other end of the line and told me to be at his downtown office at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a heavy leather briefcase stuffed with every single printed page from my corkboard. Thomas was a ruthless, high-profile corporate litigator who wore sharp, tailored suits and spoke with brutal, uncompromising efficiency. He sat behind a massive glass desk and spent 45 minutes reviewing the forged loan documents, the wire transfer receipts, and the Internet Protocol tracking logs. He did not say a single word while he read the papers. When he finally put the last document down, he looked right at me and asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to pursue this aggressive path. He firmly warned me that pursuing the case would create serious criminal exposure for both my father and my brother-in-law. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to draft the legal paperwork immediately. I told him they made their choice the moment they forged my signature and stole $400,000. Thomas nodded sharply, grabbed his desk phone, and told his senior paralegal to cancel all of his appointments for the rest of the day. We began by locking down my identity. From Thomas's office, we contacted all 3 major credit bureaus and placed security freezes on my credit files so no new account could be opened without my direct authorization. We documented the time of every call and saved the confirmation numbers. Thomas then prepared formal identity theft notices for the lenders and card issuers already implicated by my audit. His instructions were precise: preserve records, restrict unauthorized activity, and communicate through counsel, so nobody accidentally alerted the people under investigation before the evidence had been secured. He contacted the 7 credit card issuers Trent had used and gave each institution the case information needed to preserve its files. The goal was not to let Trent keep spending for dramatic effect. The goal was to stop further damage while retaining the transaction history application data and access records that showed how the fraud had been carried out. Each issuer opened its own fraud file, and Thomas made sure my disputes were documented before any account was closed or written off. Once the identity protection work was underway, Thomas and I met Detective Miller at the local Financial Crimes Unit. Miller was a veteran investigator who had spent years untangling business theft and identity cases. In a small interview room, I laid out the timeline from the supposedly $10,000 loan to the IRS discrepancy notice, the $1.2 million mansion, the folder on Robert's computer, and the forged $400,000 HELOC. I demonstrated exactly how the papers had been folded back in the warehouse and how Robert had prevented me from reviewing the terms. Thomas did not embellish anything. He kept pulling me back to dates, documents, and facts we could prove. Miller asked whether any of the HELOC proceeds had entered an account I controlled. I handed him my bank statements, diner pay stubs, and business records showing that none of the $400,000 had flowed to me. Then I gave him the wire receipt showing the transfer into Trent's holding account. He read the group chat transcript twice, stopping at Robert's message about letting the waitress take the fall. The contempt in that sentence mattered emotionally to me. To Miller, its importance was more clinical. It showed knowledge, planning, and intent. Miller opened a confidential financial crimes case for identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud, and logged the copied documents into evidence. He told me to keep my behavior unchanged while he worked with prosecutors and the court on warrants. Thomas agreed. Neither man promised an instant conviction or a perfect outcome. What they did tell me was that the evidence was unusually strong because the family had left behind both the financial trail and a written discussion of their plan. For the first time since I opened Robert's email folder, I felt the ground under me become solid again. Miller asked one final question before we left. Could I continue acting normally around them without revealing what I knew I thought about the group chat and Robert's hand on the loan papers? Then I thought about all the years I had already spent pretending not to understand their insults. I told him yes. In a strange way, that was the easiest part of the plan. My family had been rehearsing me for invisibility my entire life. They rarely asked what I thought, never asked about my work beyond the diner, and assumed any silence meant ignorance. For once, their contempt would protect me. I would give them exactly the Jessica they expected, until the evidence, the creditor rights, and the warrants were ready. Walking out of the police station with that stamped confidential report in my hand was not enough to satisfy the fury burning in my chest. Simply reporting them and walking away felt incomplete. I needed to systematically dismantle the financial ground they were currently standing on. I left Thomas at his downtown office, drove straight back to my apartment, and booted up my secure wealth management terminal. I had millions of dollars in liquid capital sitting in my anonymous corporate holding accounts. It was time to aggressively weaponize every single penny of it. I started with my father's failing construction supply business. I accessed the commercial lending registry and tracked down the primary regional bank that held the active debt portfolio for Robert's dusty warehouse. His business was severely delinquent on 3 different commercial loans. I picked up my phone and called the vice president of distressed assets at that specific regional bank. I did not sound like a young woman from Portland. I used my most authoritative corporate voice. I introduced myself as the chief executive officer of a private equity limited liability company. I offered to purchase Robert's entire distressed debt portfolio in a direct cash buyout. The regional bank was already preparing to enforce its delinquent business loans against Robert's construction supply company. Through my LLC, I offered to purchase the distressed debt at a discount for cash. The bank did not close a complex assignment on a handshake. Its attorneys reviewed my firm's proof of funds. Thomas reviewed the loan files, and the transfer documents were circulated over the next several days. Because the debt was assignable, Robert's consent was not required. By the time the transaction closed, my company stood in the regional bank's position as the principal creditor against his failing business. I had not invented a new debt or taken anything from him. I had simply bought the obligations he had already failed to pay. Next, I turned my aggressive focus directly onto Trent and Ashley. I pulled the property records for their brand new $1.2 million mansion in the gated community. Trent had used the stolen $400,000 as a massive cash down payment, but he had financed the remaining $800,000 through a very specific private boutique lending trust located in Chicago. He chose a private trust because he wrongly thought it would protect his asset from standard creditor seizure. I then approached the private lending trust that held the roughly $800,000 mortgage on Trent and Ashley's new mansion. The note was new and technically current, so the trust had no reason to sell cheaply. I offered a premium above the outstanding principal and backed the offer with immediate proof of funds. Thomas handled the negotiations, so the transaction would be documented cleanly. The trust's managers cared about one thing: whether selling the note produced a safe profit without exposing them to the growing fraud problem surrounding the down payment. The assignment took several days of document review, not a few impulsive phone calls. We examined the mortgage, the security instrument, and the default provisions tied to fraud in the acquisition funds. The $400,000 down payment had come directly from the forged HELOC proceeds, which gave the lender contractual remedies once that fraud was formally established. My LLC purchased the mortgage note and the related enforcement rights. I authorized the wire only after Thomas confirmed the chain of assignment, and the lender's records matched the property documents. By the end of the process, I controlled the debt that kept Trent and Ashley in their mansion, while Miller and the court were moving separately on the criminal case. I stood in my home office and studied the new documents on the corkboard. My LLC now held Robert's distressed business debt and the mortgage note on Trent and Ashley's $1.2 million house. That did not mean I could snap my fingers and rewrite property law. It meant I controlled the creditor rights that mattered when the defaults and fraud remedies were triggered. Under the plan Thomas had structured, those rights would be exercised in coordination with the injunctions and notices timed for the retirement party. The balance of power had reversed without a single argument at the family dinner table. They still saw a woman in a stained waitress uniform. Behind that uniform stood the creditor they would soon have to answer to. Thomas warned me not to confuse financial leverage with personal revenge. Every notice had to be justified by an existing contract, every demand had to follow the documents, and every property action had to run through the legal process. I agreed. That distinction mattered to me more than he realized. Robert and Trent had manipulated paperwork because they believed power meant being clever enough to escape rules. I wanted the opposite. I wanted every step of my response to survive scrutiny from a judge, a lender, or an auditor who had never met my family. If I was going to reclaim control, I wanted to do it without becoming another person who treated signatures and ownership as props. At dinner, every demand they made also confirmed that nothing in their behavior had changed. Susan still used shame as a leash. Ashley still treated inconvenience as an emergency that belonged to someone else. Trent still confused expensive purchases with competence. Robert still expected obedience the moment he raised his voice. The difference was entirely inside me. A month earlier, those same gestures would have made me question whether I was being selfish. Now I could hear them without absorbing them. That emotional distance was part of the counterattack, too. I was not waiting for an apology before I acted, and I was not trying to persuade them to understand why they had hurt me. I only needed them to continue being exactly who they had always been until the legal work was ready. Susan was standing in the grand foyer, arranging a massive bouquet of expensive white lilies inside a tall crystal vase. She turned around when the door hinges creaked. She took one look at my grease-stained shirt and immediately pinched her nose tight with her manicured fingers. She told me I smelled like a public garbage can and demanded I take my shoes off outside on the concrete porch so I did not track cheap diner grease onto her pristine hardwood floors. I complied silently without a single word of protest. I stepped backward out the door, kicked off my worn black work shoes, and left them outside in the cold evening air. I walked into the formal dining room on my stocking feet. The long mahogany table was already set with Susan's finest imported china and heavy silver flatware. Trent and Ashley were sitting close together on one side of the large table. Trent was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer. I was pouring a heavy measure of dark amber scotch into a crystal glass. Ashley was aggressively typing on her modern silver smartphone with her long painted fingernails. She wore a bright red designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly diner rent. Robert sat at the head of the table carving a massive roasted turkey with an electric carving knife. The room smelled like expensive cologne roasted meat and melted butter. Susan followed me into the dining room and immediately started criticizing my physical appearance in front of everyone. She pointed her silver serving fork directly at my face and told me my hair looked like a tangled bird nest. She commanded me to go into the downstairs guest bathroom and aggressively scrub my hands and arms with harsh antibacterial soap before I was allowed to touch any of the serving plates. She loudly complained to Trent that it was completely exhausting having a daughter who refused to take basic pride in her personal hygiene. I did not argue with her command. I turned around, walked down the hallway into the small guest bathroom and washed my hands with scalding hot water. I stared at my own tired reflection in the mirror above the sink. I forced my shoulders to slump forward to perfectly mimic the posture of a completely defeated, broken woman. I returned to the dining room and silently took on my designated role as the unpaid family servant. I picked up the heavy porcelain serving bowls and began placing large portions of garlic mashed potatoes and roasted carrots onto their expensive china plates. I carried a large silver platter of sliced turkey around the table. I stood beside Trent and offered him a portion. He ignored the serving tongs, reached out with his own personal fork, and stabbed a large piece of meat directly off the platter. He did not say thank you. He just chewed loudly and asked Ashley if the pool contractor was coming on Tuesday to install the imported blue tiles for their infinity pool. Ashley nodded and said she had to wire them an extra $15,000 to expedite the shipping. I stood there holding the heavy silver platter, knowing the $15,000 she was casually spending was stolen directly from my credit line. I moved over to Susan. She inspected the turkey slices critically before using the tongs to select the smallest, driest piece. She told me I had carved the meat completely wrong and ruined the presentation. I walked around the large chairs and served Ashley next. She pushed her plate away slightly with her fingertips and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh that echoed loudly through the quiet room. Ashley began a long, exhaustive rant about the immense psychological stress of decorating her brand-new $1.2 million luxury estate. She took a tiny sip of her sparkling water and complained that the custom Italian marble contractors were delaying the installation of her secondary master bathroom vanity. She said the imported gray stone was currently sitting in a metal shipping container in a foreign port, and it was completely ruining her entire domestic timeline. She aggressively tapped her silver fork against her plate and whined that it was physically exhausting managing so many incompetent construction workers who did not respect her vision. Trent chimed in and loudly agreed with his wife. He took a large bite of turkey, chewed it with his mouth slightly open, and began complaining about the custom landscaping bill for their sprawling front yard. He told Robert they had just paid $40,000 to plant mature oak trees along their private circular driveway. He said the Gated Community Homeowners Association was being completely unreasonable about the specific height requirements for their new security hedges. He took a long drink of his expensive scotch and bragged that he was going to threaten the association board with a massive lawsuit if they did not approve his architectural plans by Monday morning. I stood quietly behind Ashley's tall wooden chair, holding a heavy glass pitcher of ice water. I poured the cold water into her crystal goblet and listened to them loudly complain about the immense burden of spending my stolen equity. Ashley looked over her shoulder at me. She told me I was so incredibly lucky I lived in a tiny, cheap apartment because I never had to worry about managing massive luxury property disputes. She said simple people like me had absolutely no idea how difficult it was to maintain a multi-million-dollar lifestyle in a competitive neighborhood. I looked down at the expensive diamond tennis bracelet sparkling brightly on her wrist. I knew exactly which of my fraudulent credit cards had paid for that specific piece of jewelry. I kept my face totally blank. I nodded my head slowly, walked over to pour water into Trent's empty glass, and told Ashley she was absolutely right. I told her I could not even imagine having that much financial responsibility on my shoulders. Robert stood up from his chair to demonstrate his upcoming retirement speech. He raised his glass of bourbon and practiced his opening lines to the empty dining room walls. He spoke about his decades of hard work, his relentless dedication to the community, and his unyielding integrity as a businessman. He said a man is only as good as his legacy, and he was proud to leave his legacy in the capable hands of Trent and Ashley. He went on for 10 full minutes listing his imaginary accomplishments while completely ignoring the fact that his real legacy was felony bank fraud and identity theft. I stood in the corner of the room with my hands folded behind my back, watching the performance of a pure, unadulterated narcissist. I was practicing the exact speech he planned to give right before the lender initiated its hostile collection protocols against my name. Robert wiped his mouth with a crisp white linen napkin, sat back down, and loudly cleared his throat to command the attention of the entire room. He announced that his massive retirement party at the country club was going to be the absolute pinnacle of his entire professional career. He boasted that over 150 elite guests were attending the catered event. He proudly listed the names of the local bank president, the senior church pastor, and 3 prominent city politicians who had confirmed their attendance. He smiled a wide, arrogant smile and told Trent this massive party would cement the family legacy in the local business community forever. Then Robert turned his head and looked directly down the length of the long mahogany table at me. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He set his heavy carving knife down on the table. He told me the exclusive country club was charging an absolute fortune for the formal prime rib dinner service. He said he had decided to significantly cut the catering costs by utilizing available family resources instead. Robert pointed his thick index finger straight at my chest. He demanded that I arrive at the country club at exactly 5 in the morning on the day of the party. He told me I was going to serve as the primary catering assistant and cleanup crew for the entire 12-hour event. He commanded me to wear my black diner uniform, carry the heavy appetizer trays around the ballroom, pour the champagne for his wealthy guests, and personally clean up the dirty dinner plates when the party ended. He said I would also be responsible for standing by the front doors to collect the coats of his important business partners. I set the heavy glass water pitcher down on the wooden table. I looked directly at my father and asked him if the country club was paying an hourly wage for the additional catering staff. Robert slammed his closed fist down hard on the table. The crystal glasses and silver flatware rattled violently against the polished wood. He raised his voice and aggressively told me I was not getting paid a single dime for this physical labor. He said I was going to serve his elite guests completely for free to finally earn my keep in this family. He reminded me that he had generously put a roof over my head when I was a helpless child. He said volunteering to clean up dirty garbage at his retirement party was the absolute bare minimum I could do to repay my massive lifelong debt to him. Susan quickly joined the verbal attack. She leaned forward over her plate of untouched roasted vegetables and told me I was acting completely ungrateful and selfish. She said I should be honored to serve successful people and learn how the real corporate world operates. Trent laughed loudly from his side of the table. He told Robert to make sure I did not drop any cheap diner food on the expensive country club carpets because I was probably too clumsy to carry a silver tray properly. Ashley chimed in and demanded I make sure her specific gluten-free meals were prepared entirely separately in the back kitchen, so she did not have to wait in the regular buffet line with the standard guests. They completely surrounded me with their cruel demands. They treated me like a lowly, indentured servant who existed solely for their convenience. They expected me to show up at the crack of dawn and perform exhausting physical labor for 12 hours straight to celebrate a retirement funded entirely by my stolen identity. They wanted me to literally carry the silver trays and clean the garbage at the exact moment they planned to throw me to the authorities to take the fall for their massive financial crimes. They wanted to humiliate me one final time before they destroyed my life forever. I stood perfectly still at the far end of the large dining table. I did not cry. I did not argue with their ridiculous demands. I did not try to defend myself against their relentless insults. I just looked at Robert. I looked at the man who had maliciously forged my signature on a massive commercial loan. I looked at the man who was actively planning to let me go to a prison so he could drink fine bourbon and play golf with his wealthy friends. I let a slow, wide, completely genuine smile spread across my face. It was the most honest smile I had shown them in my entire life. I looked Robert directly in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft and remarkably polite. I told him I would be absolutely delighted to cater his retirement party. I told him I would arrive exactly on time and perform every single duty he requested. I promised him I would handle every single detail of the event and make sure it was a night no one in the family would ever forget. Robert grunted loudly, clearly satisfied with my total verbal submission. He told me to go into the kitchen and start washing the dirty cooking pots because the family dinner was officially over. I turned around and walked quietly into the kitchen. I turned on the hot water faucet and plunged my bare hands into the soapy water. I scrubbed the burnt grease off the bottom of a heavy cast-iron skillet with a rough steel wool pad. The hot soapy water burned my skin, but I did not stop. I listened to the sounds of my family laughing and drinking in the dining room. I heard Trent bragging about another fake real estate deal. I heard Ashley complaining about the color of her new silk curtains. I heard Susan agreeing with everything they said. The psychological tension inside my own mind was intoxicating. I was holding a massive, devastating secret that was going to fundamentally alter the course of their lives forever. I rinsed the cast-iron skillet, dried it carefully with a clean towel, and placed it perfectly inside the wooden cabinet. I turned off the kitchen faucet and wiped my wet hands on my stained diner apron. I was washing the dirty dishes of a man whose entire business portfolio was currently locked inside my private corporate vault. I was serving ice water to a sister who was sleeping inside a massive luxury mansion that I legally controlled. They thought they had successfully backed me into a dark corner and forced me into total servitude. They believed I was just a stupid, helpless waitress who would blindly carry their garbage and accept their fraudulent debt. They had absolutely no idea that Tuesday was coming. The trap was set. All I had to do was show up, serve the champagne, and watch the authorities drop the hammer on their perfect, wealthy lives. I pulled my rattling rusted sedan into the gravel service lot of the Oak Ridge Country Club at exactly 4:30 in the morning. The air was bitterly cold, and a thick layer of white frost covered the perfectly manicured golf course greens stretching out behind the main building. I turned off the engine, grabbed a heavy cardboard box of cheap paper napkins from my trunk, and walked toward the metal service doors at the back of the massive brick estate. The club manager was a tall, stern man holding a clipboard who looked my dirty car and my stained uniform up and down with obvious disgust. He pointed a stiff finger toward the main ballroom and told me to start setting up the buffet tables immediately because they were severely understaffed for the morning prep. I walked into the cavernous, silent room and began my grueling physical labor. I unfolded massive white linen tablecloths and draped them carefully over 10 long wooden banquet tables. I carried heavy stainless steel chafing dishes from the back kitchen, hauling them 2 at a time against my chest, and lined them up with perfect precision along the buffet line. I spent the next 3 hours entirely alone in the massive room. I lit dozens of small chemical sternos under the metal water pans, burning my fingertips on the hot metal grates in the process. I polished hundreds of silver forks and knives until my hands ached, wrapping each one tightly in a stiff cloth napkin and stacking them into neat pyramids. I arranged towering displays of crystal champagne flutes on a round mahogany table near the main entrance. I was wearing my dark gray diner uniform, the exact same heavily stained shirt and black non-slip shoes I wore to pour cheap coffee on the highway. My lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache from carrying the heavy equipment, but I did not stop moving for a single second. I arranged massive ceramic platters of expensive shrimp cocktail-sliced prime rib and imported cheeses. I lifted heavy plastic bags of crushed ice and dumped them violently into the deep silver cooling bins to prepare for the seafood display. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung wide open. Susan walked in accompanied by 4 of her wealthiest friends from the suburban church. They were all wearing expensive pastel dresses, heavy pearl necklaces, and perfectly styled hair. Susan completely ignored my presence as I stood behind the carving station holding a large metal serving fork. She walked rapidly around the ballroom, pointing at the floral arrangements and demanding the club staff move the heavy tables closer to the large bay windows so the natural light would hit the centerpieces perfectly. Her friends followed closely behind her, whispering and pointing discreetly in my direction. A woman named Barbara walked over to the buffet line and looked at my grease-stained uniform with an expression of profound, uncomfortable pity. She reached into her expensive leather designer purse, pulled out a crisp $5 bill, and pushed it directly into my empty hand. She told me I must have to work so incredibly hard to make ends meet in this terrible economy. She patted my shoulder condescendingly and told me she would pray for my financial situation at Sunday service. I did not throw the money back in her face. I simply lowered my head, thanked her politely for her immense generosity, and slid the small bill into my apron pocket. I played the pathetic broken waitress perfectly. 10 minutes later, Trent and Ashley strolled into the ballroom holding hands. Ashley was complaining loudly about the gravel in the parking lot scratching the bottom of her imported high-heel shoes. She looked around the country club ballroom and loudly stated that the chandeliers here looked incredibly cheap compared to the custom lighting fixtures she had just installed in her new mansion. Trent walked straight over to the temporary bar station I had just finished stocking with clean glasses. He snapped his fingers aggressively in my face and demanded I go down into the basement wine cellar to fetch a very specific, highly expensive bottle of aged scotch. He told me not to drop it because the bottle cost more than I made in an entire month at the pathetic roadside diner. I nodded, silently, turned around and walked straight through the swinging metal kitchen doors. I did not go to the basement wine cellar. I stepped into a small, empty supply closet near the industrial dishwashing station and locked the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. I reached deep into the hidden interior pocket of my apron and pulled out my highly encrypted secure smartphone. I dialed the direct private line of my corporate litigator, Thomas Bradley. He answered on the very first ring. I asked him for an immediate status update on the synchronized tactical strike. Thomas kept his voice low. He told me the judge had signed the fraud-related warrants and orders that morning based on Detective Miller's investigation and the evidence Thomas had submitted. Miller and the financial crimes officers were waiting outside the country club property for the coordinated entry. The criminal case and the creditor actions were separate tracks, but the timing had been synchronized, so Robert and Trent would not have hours to move money, destroy records, or disappear after the public confrontation began. Thomas also confirmed that the financial restrictions were active. The institutions holding Trent's fraudulent accounts had frozen the disputed funds and preserved the records. At Robert's warehouse, an authorized process server was posting the creditor and enforcement notices tied to the business debt my LLC had purchased. At Trent and Ashley's mansion, a separate server was delivering the mortgage default and fraud notices that began the legal process against the property. No one was being magically evicted in a single afternoon. The point was that the legal machinery had started and could no longer be quietly undone by a phone call from Trent. I thanked Thomas, ended the call, and put the phone back inside my apron. When I returned to the ballroom, I carried the same tired posture as before. The only difference was that I now knew every necessary piece was in motion. I stayed in the supply closet for another 10 seconds after the call ended and listened to the industrial dishwasher rumble through the wall. My hands were calm. That surprised me. I had imagined this day for nearly 2 weeks as a storm of adrenaline, but the closer we got to the confrontation, the quieter I became. The hard work had already happened in offices, phone calls, document reviews, and evidence logs. What remained was not improvisation. It was execution. I straightened the cheap name tag on my uniform, picked up the bottle Trent had demanded, and walked back toward the ballroom, carrying exactly the expression he expected to see. As the ballroom filled, I kept noticing how carefully Robert had staged his image. His company's logo appeared on printed programs, even though the business was drowning in debt. Photographs from old construction projects sat on easels near the entrance. The champagne, the tuxedo, the guest list, and the country club setting all told the same story he wanted people to believe: disciplined businessman, generous father, respected community figure. I understood then why exposing the documents privately would never have been enough for me. The crime could have been handled privately, but the lie had been built publicly. Robert had used a crowd to turn my supposed failure into part of his success story. If he chose to repeat that lie into a microphone, I would answer it in the same room with records instead of insults. The massive room was rapidly filling with elite wealthy guests. Over 150 people milled around the polished wooden dance floor. Local city politicians, wealthy church elders, and regional business partners, wearing expensive tailored suits, gathered in small, tight circles, laughing loudly and drinking premium cocktails. I walked silently through the dense crowd, carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with tall glasses of bubbling champagne. I kept my head down and focused entirely on the exhausting physical labor of the event. I cleared crumpled paper napkins off the small cocktail tables. I emptied foul-smelling glass ashtrays on the outdoor smoking patio. I wiped spilled red wine off the pristine white tablecloths with a damp bar towel, crawling on my hands and knees to clean the spots on the floor so Susan would not yell at me. Every time I passed a group of my father's wealthy friends, I heard them praising his incredible business acumen. I heard them talking about how Trent was a brilliant, rising star in the luxury real estate market, and how lucky Robert was to have such a successful son-in-law. Robert finally made his grand entrance through the main double doors. He was wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo that he had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen credit line. He walked proudly into the center of the ballroom with a massive, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He shook hands vigorously with the local bank president and loudly accepted lavish congratulations from the senior church pastor. He looked exactly like a triumphant king holding court in his own personal castle. He spotted me standing near the buffet table holding a massive stack of dirty appetizer plates. He immediately raised his hand high in the air and aggressively snapped his fingers at me from across the crowded room. He loudly ordered me to stop standing around doing absolutely nothing and fetch him a fresh glass of sparkling water with exactly 2 cubes of ice. I set the heavy stack of dirty ceramic plates down on a nearby wooden table. I walked over to the beverage station, poured the sparkling water, and carefully carried the crystal glass across the busy dance floor. I handed the cold drink directly to the man who had forged my signature to steal $500,000. He did not say thank you. He just took the glass, turned his back to me completely, and continued loudly bragging to a city councilman about his upcoming luxury vacation to the south of France. I stepped back into the shadows near the heavy velvet window curtains and looked up at the large brass clock hanging on the far wall of the ballroom. The hour hand slowly ticked past 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The retirement party was reaching its absolute peak. The noise of the crowd was a deafening roar of laughter, clinking crystal glasses, and smooth jazz music playing from the live band in the corner. I reached into my apron pocket and felt my secure phone vibrate a single time against my leg. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. I had one new encrypted text message from Thomas Bradley. The message contained a single simple sentence: "The financial crimes officers are walking through the front lobby doors in exactly 5 minutes." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and smoothed out the deep wrinkles in my dirty gray uniform. I looked across the vast room at Susan, who was loudly laughing with her wealthy friends and showing off a massive diamond necklace that belonged entirely to my bank account. I looked at Ashley, who was aggressively complaining to a frightened waiter that her prime rib was slightly overcooked and demanding he bring her a fresh plate immediately. I looked at Trent, who was forcefully swirling his scotch and lying to an innocent investor about a completely fake commercial property deal he claimed was worth millions. And finally I looked at Robert. He was slowly walking toward the small wooden stage at the front of the ballroom, tapping a silver spoon against a crystal glass, preparing to take the microphone and deliver his glorious legacy-defining retirement speech. The atmosphere in the room was thick with stolen wealth, blinding arrogance, and total absolute certainty. They felt completely untouchable. They believed they had successfully executed the perfect financial crime entirely at my expense, and they were preparing to celebrate their massive victory in front of the entire town. I stood perfectly still by the heavy velvet curtains, crossed my tired arms over my chest, and waited for the glorious, devastating reality to completely shatter their perfect illusion. The club manager suddenly snapped his fingers sharply in my direction and ordered me to carry a fresh tray of tall champagne glasses out to the center tables. I stepped away from the heavy velvet window curtains, picked up the massive silver serving tray, and walked directly into the dense, loud crowd of 150 elite guests. The noise inside the country club ballroom was absolutely deafening. Local business partners in expensive tailored suits were aggressively shaking hands, slapping each other on the back, and laughing loudly about their massive corporate profits. Senior church elders from my mother's suburban congregation were gathered closely around a large carved ice sculpture. They were drinking premium mixed cocktails and speaking in hushed, deeply reverent tones about my father's incredible lifetime of hard work and moral integrity. I carefully navigated through the tight, crowded spaces between the round mahogany banquet tables, balancing the heavy silver tray securely on my right shoulder. I stopped at a large table near the front of the wooden stage where my mother was actively holding court. Susan was wearing a brand new black designer evening gown and proudly showing off her expensive pearl jewelry to the wealthy wives of the local city councilmen. I carefully lowered the heavy silver tray and placed 4 crystal glasses of bubbling champagne onto their pristine white linen tablecloth. Susan did not even bother to look up at my face. She simply waved her manicured hand dismissively in my direction and told her wealthy friends that reliable, hardworking help was so incredibly hard to find these days. I kept my expression completely blank, quietly picked up 3 dirty ceramic appetizer plates from the center of their table, and moved steadily toward the next group of guests. Trent and Ashley were standing near the main polished wooden bar station. Trent was loudly explaining his highly aggressive commercial real estate strategies to a group of older, wealthy investors. I walked up quietly behind them to collect their empty cocktail glasses. Trent turned around abruptly, saw my dark, grease-stained diner uniform, and let out a sharp, mocking sound of total disgust. He told the gathered investors that I was the only person in the entire family who did not understand how to properly leverage basic financial capital. He ordered me to go straight back to the hot kitchen and fetch him a fresh plate of hot crab cakes because the main buffet line was entirely empty. I nodded politely, gathered his sticky glasses onto my tray, and walked toward the swinging metal kitchen doors. I did not go to the kitchen to get his food. I simply grabbed a fresh tray of sparkling water from the server station and walked right back out into the bright lights of the center ballroom. Robert suddenly walked up the short wooden steps and stepped onto the raised stage at the front of the massive room. The live jazz band playing in the corner immediately stopped playing their instruments. The bright overhead spotlights shifted instantly and focused entirely on my father. He stood tall behind the heavy wooden podium and confidently picked up the silver microphone. He tapped his thick index finger aggressively against the metal grill to command the immediate attention of the entire room. The loud, chaotic chatter of the 150 wealthy guests slowly died down into a highly respectful, expectant silence. Robert cleared his throat loudly and began his grand legacy-defining retirement speech. He spoke with the smooth, practiced rhythm of a veteran politician running for local office. He formally welcomed the church elders, the city officials, and his deeply dedicated commercial business partners. He thanked them all for gathering together to celebrate his decades of unyielding dedication to the local construction industry. He gripped the outer edges of the wooden podium tightly and told the silent crowd a long, highly elaborate story about how he first started his supply business. He claimed he began his corporate journey with absolutely nothing but a rusty old pickup truck, a small box of tools, and a fierce, uncompromising work ethic. He told them he had spent 30 continuous years sacrificing his own personal comfort and physical health to build a pristine, highly ethical corporate empire from the ground up. I stood near the edge of the polished wooden dance floor, holding my heavy silver tray of sparkling water perfectly still. I watched him lie effortlessly to the entire town. Robert spoke passionately about the heavy, demanding burden of financial leadership. He said a true, honest businessman never takes the easy way out and always honors his legal and financial debts. He proudly told the attentive audience that the true measure of a man is the exact legacy he leaves behind for his family and his community. He raised his right hand high in the air and gestured broadly toward the front row table where Trent and Ashley were sitting comfortably. Robert smiled a massive, glowing smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He told the crowd that his absolute greatest achievement in life was not his massive corporate bank account or his thriving supply warehouse. He said his single greatest achievement was his beautiful, intelligent daughter, Ashley, and his brilliant, highly successful son-in-law, Trent. The entire room immediately erupted into loud, respectful applause. Robert waited patiently for the clapping to completely subside before he continued his grand performance. He praised Trent extensively for his highly aggressive, incredibly successful expansion into the luxury real estate market over the past year. He told the church elders and the city politicians that Trent and Ashley had just purchased a massive multi-million-dollar estate in the absolute most exclusive gated community in the entire county. Robert leaned much closer to the silver microphone and proudly declared that Trent and Ashley were the true, undisputed future of the family empire. He said they deeply understood the complex, critical value of hard work, elite corporate education, and relentless financial strategy. He told the captivated crowd he could finally and comfortably enter his golden years of peaceful retirement because he knew his massive legacy was resting securely in their highly capable, incredibly wealthy hands. Trent stood up from his padded chair, buttoned his tailored navy blue blazer with a smug expression, and proudly waved to the loudly cheering audience. Ashley smiled brightly, touched her expensive diamond necklace, and blew a dramatic, theatrical kiss to her father standing on the stage. I began walking slowly and deliberately across the front of the stage, carrying my heavy tray of water glasses toward the far side of the ballroom. I was still wearing my deeply stained gray waitress shirt and my heavily worn black non-slip shoes. I was trying to silently clear the empty crystal cocktail glasses from the front row banquet tables while the loud applause continued to echo around the room. Robert suddenly stopped clapping his hands. He looked down from the elevated wooden stage, and his eyes locked directly onto my dirty uniform. The arrogant, triumphant smile on his face quickly shifted into something deeply cruel, highly calculated, and immensely dark. He clearly decided in that exact moment that he needed one final massive punchline to completely elevate his own superiority in front of his wealthy, successful peers. He wanted to highlight the massive contrast between his own fabricated success and my apparent total failure. He raised his thick index finger and pointed it aggressively straight down at my chest. He held the silver microphone very close to his mouth so his deep voice would echo loudly and clearly through the massive country club speaker system. Robert told the crowd he wanted to introduce someone else before he finished his speech. He kept his finger pointed directly at my stained diner uniform so every single person in the room would turn and look at me. He announced to the suddenly silent room that I was his other daughter. He let out a loud, highly exaggerated sigh into the microphone and shook his head with deep theatrical disappointment. He told the 150 elite guests that I had absolutely no college degree, absolutely no professional future, and that I simply poured cheap, terrible coffee at a local highway diner. He told the entire ballroom that I just constantly freeloaded off the immense success and hard work of the rest of the family. A low, rumbling sound of laughter started near the front tables exactly where Susan and her wealthy church friends were sitting. The cruel laughter quickly spread across the massive ballroom like a rapid wave. Church elders chuckled quietly into their white linen napkins. Regional business partners smirked, pointed their fingers at my worn work shoes, and shook their heads in profound pity. Trent and Ashley laughed the absolute loudest of all, throwing their heads back and smiling at my total public humiliation. The entire room full of wealthy, highly successful people actively and openly mocked me. They stared at my dirty clothes, my wrinkled gray apron, and my tired, slumping posture. I did not shed a single tear. I did not drop my heavy silver tray. I did not turn around and run out of the heavy double doors in absolute shame. I stood perfectly straight and completely still in the exact center of the polished wooden dance floor. The deafening, overwhelming sound of their cruel laughter washed entirely over me, but it did not hurt me at all. I looked up at Robert standing so incredibly proudly on the brightly lit stage. I looked at Trent and Ashley sitting comfortably at their expensive front row table. I looked at Susan wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. I felt the heavy, vibrating weight of my secure cell phone resting safely in my deep apron pocket, and I knew the financial crimes officers were currently stepping out of their unmarked vehicles just outside the main lobby doors. I walked slowly and incredibly deliberately toward the closest empty mahogany banquet table. The crowd watched my every movement, their laughter slowly dying down as they waited to see my reaction. I placed both of my tired hands firmly on the outer edges of the heavy silver serving tray. I carefully and perfectly lowered the tray onto the crisp white linen tablecloth. I made absolutely sure that not a single drop of sparkling water spilled from the tall crystal glasses. I turned my body back around to directly face the wooden stage. I reached behind my waist with both hands and firmly gripped the tight, grease-covered knot of my dark gray diner apron. The apron hitting the floor changed the room more than any shout could have. Until that second, everyone had understood me through Robert's description, the daughter who served, cleaned, and failed. When I stood upright, the contrast made people look again. I could see it in the nearest faces. They were not suddenly on my side. They simply realized there was something about the scene they had misunderstood. That small uncertainty was enough. I had spent years allowing my family to define me before I spoke. Now I was going to make them listen to facts they could not laugh away. I pulled the strings hard and untied the knot. I lifted the stained apron over my head, let it fall onto the pristine country club floor, rolled my shoulders back and raised my chin. For the first time that day, I stopped performing exhaustion for anyone. The sudden movement caught the immediate attention of the people sitting at the closest banquet tables. A wealthy woman in a blue silk dress gasped softly and covered her mouth with her hand. I stepped off the carpeted area and walked directly onto the polished wooden dance floor. My black non-slip shoes squeaked slightly against the smooth wood, but I did not look down at the ground. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father standing on the elevated stage. Robert stopped talking right in the middle of a grand sentence. His arrogant smile vanished instantly. He leaned over the heavy wooden podium and glared down at me with absolute venom in his eyes. He commanded me to pick my dirty apron up off the floor and get back to the kitchen immediately. I did not stop walking. I took another deliberate step forward. The entire ballroom grew completely silent. The constant clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped entirely. 150 wealthy guests turned in their expensive padded chairs to watch the struggling waitress march toward the guest of honor. I reached the bottom of the short wooden staircase leading up to the stage. Robert stepped away from the podium and stood at the top of the stairs to physically block my path. He hissed at me under his breath, demanding to know what I thought I was doing and warning me that I was ruining his perfect night. I looked right through him. I stepped up onto the first wooden stair, forcing him to take a step backward to avoid a physical collision. I took another step. I drove him all the way back to the center of the stage. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer shock of my sudden, relentless defiance. I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from his trembling hand. He was too stunned to pull it away. I turned to face the massive, silent ballroom. I held the cold metal microphone close to my mouth. I looked down at the front row table where Susan, Ashley, and Trent were sitting, with their mouths hanging wide open in total disbelief. I smiled a bright, genuine smile. I told the crowd that my father was absolutely right about one specific thing. I raised my empty hand in the air like I was holding an imaginary glass and told them cheers, because this is the last time any of you will ever see me. I watched the utter confusion wash over the faces of the local politicians and the church elders. I did not drop the microphone and walk out of the room. I kept my grip incredibly firm. I told the audience that before I left, I wanted to give my father the retirement gift he truly deserved. I raised my left hand and pointed straight toward the massive double oak doors at the very back of the ballroom. I nodded my head once. The heavy wooden doors swung wide open with a loud, echoing thud. The sudden noise made several guests jump in their seats. Thomas Bradley, my high-profile corporate litigator, walked through the doorway. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. He carried a thick stack of heavy manila folders securely under his left arm. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with brutal, uncompromising purpose. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea to let him pass. Thomas did not look at the crowd. He walked straight up to the stage, climbed the wooden steps, and handed the heavy stack of folders directly to me. He stood silently and intimidatingly by my right side, with his hands folded in front of him. I took the folders and walked slowly down the wooden steps. I approached the front row table. The The silence in the room was so absolute that the only sound was the rustling of the thick paper in my hands. I stopped right in front of Trent. He was sweating profusely. Small beads of moisture shined on his forehead, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. I tossed the first heavy manila folder directly onto his pristine white dinner plate. It landed with a loud, satisfying slap. I turned to Susan and dropped the second folder right in front of her expensive crystal wine glass. I turned around and looked up at Robert, who was still standing frozen on the stage. I walked back up the stairs, walked right up to his chest, and pressed the third thick folder firmly into his hands. I stepped back to the podium and leaned into the microphone. I told them to open the folders. I instructed the entire ballroom to pay close attention to the documents inside. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion. I told the crowd that the very first page they were looking at was a massive commercial home equity line of credit for exactly $400,000. I told them to look closely at the signature on the bottom line. I explained that my father and my brother-in-law had deliberately forged my signature using a fake online notary to completely drain the equity out of the family home. I heard a loud gasp ripple through the audience. I heard a city councilman in the second row whisper in shock to his wife. Robert stared down at the forged document in his hands. His face turned the color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I continued speaking into the microphone, commanding the entire room. I told them to turn to the second page. I explained that it was a verified wire transfer receipt showing the exact movement of the stolen $400,000. I pointed directly at Trent sitting in the front row. I told the wealthy guests that Trent had illegally wired the stolen money into a hidden corporate holding account to buy his brand new $1.2 million luxury mansion. I told the crowd that Trent was not a brilliant real estate investor. I explained that his entire business was a complete mirage, funded entirely by felony bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. Ashley let out a sharp, panicked cry. She grabbed Trent by the arm and demanded he tell everyone I was lying. Trent did not say a word. He was staring at the printed IP access logs in the folder, realizing we had tracked his exact digital footprint perfectly. Susan stood up from her chair. Her hands were shaking violently. She pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled that I was just a stupid, uneducated diner waitress who did not understand complex financial documents. I smiled down at her from the stage. I told her I had a very important secret to share. I leaned closer to the microphone. I told the entire room that I was not a community college dropout. I announced that I was a fully licensed, certified public accountant. I explained that I was the chief executive officer and sole owner of a highly lucrative virtual wealth management firm that controlled tens of millions of dollars in corporate assets. The shock in the ballroom was palpable and heavy. The local bank president, sitting in the third row, literally dropped his silver fork onto his ceramic plate, creating a loud clinking sound that echoed in the quiet space. I turned my attention back to Robert. He looked like a man who was about to physically collapse. He was leaning heavily against the wooden stage wall for support. I delivered the final devastating blow. I told him to look at the third page in his folder. I told him I did not just call the police and freeze the stolen money. I told him I used my own corporate capital to purchase the distressed debt portfolio of his failing construction business. I turned to Trent and told him I had also legally purchased the massive private mortgage note on his brand new luxury mansion. I took a deep breath and delivered the exact words I had been waiting to say. I looked my father dead in the eye and spoke clearly into the silver microphone. I told him I did not just freeze the stolen money, Dad. My company bought your loans. I own your business, I own Trent's house, and you are all currently trespassing on my assets. The reaction moved through the ballroom in layers. Some guests stared at me. Others looked down at the documents in front of Robert and Trent. A few people who had laughed minutes earlier stopped meeting anyone's eyes. The bank president leaned forward, reading the first page of the HELOC copy with the concentration of someone who understood exactly what a forged guarantor signature could mean. The church friends who had treated Susan's social standing as unquestionable began whispering to one another. I did not enjoy their discomfort. What satisfied me was watching Robert lose control of the narrative. For years he had been able to make a joke raise his voice or invoke family and end every argument. A verified wire receipt did not care how loudly he spoke. I also made one thing clear before I finished speaking. I was not claiming that wealth made me better than them. My money was not the point. The point was that they had decided a waitress was disposable. They believed education mattered only when it belonged to Trent. Work mattered only when it produced status, and family loyalty meant I should accept whatever they took from me. Revealing my firm destroyed their assumptions, but the forged documents were what condemned their choices. If I had truly been nothing more than the diner waitress they mocked, the fraud would still have been wrong. That was the part I wanted the room to understand before anyone turned my revenge into a story about a secret millionaire humiliating poorer relatives. The reality of my words crashed down on them like a heavy concrete block. Susan let out a loud wailing sob and collapsed backward into her padded chair. She covered her face with her hands and began crying hysterically in front of all her wealthy church friends. Robert dropped the manila folder onto the wooden stage. The heavy papers scattered everywhere, drifting slowly across the polished floor. He reached a shaking hand out toward me and weakly begged me to stop talking. He pleaded with me to remember that we were a family. I stared back at him with absolutely zero sympathy and reminded him that family does not forge a daughter's signature and risk her freedom. Trent did not beg. The sheer, overwhelming panic completely consumed him. He knew the strict terms of his private mortgage. He knew the massive debt was already legally in default. He knew he was facing serious prison exposure for wire fraud. Trent suddenly shoved his chair backward with tremendous force. The heavy wooden chair tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. He ignored Ashley completely as she tried to grab his jacket. He ripped his arm away from her grip and started breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. Trent turned away from the front table and sprinted blindly toward the side exit doors of the ballroom. He shoved past a stunned waiter and knocked a silver tray of champagne glasses onto the carpet. The glass shattered everywhere, sending sharp shards across the floor. He grabbed the brass handle of the heavy wooden side door and threw it open, desperate to escape into the dark gravel parking lot. But he did not make it outside. Detective Miller and 4 financial crimes officers were already standing in the narrow hallway waiting for him. They stepped forward in unison and immediately blocked his path. Detective Miller caught Trent at the side exit with 2 financial crimes officers beside him. They stopped him before he reached the parking lot, turned him back toward the wall, and placed him in handcuffs, while another pair of officers entered the ballroom for Robert. The arrests were controlled and deliberate, nothing like the theatrical chaos Robert had expected from everyone else. Robert protested that he was a respected businessman and that the documents were a misunderstanding. But Miller did not debate the case in the ballroom. He read the required information, secured Robert, and escorted him out. I stood on the stage and watched the men who had spent months arranging paperwork around my identity finally become the people being led away by someone else's procedure. The feeling was not triumph in the way I had imagined it during my angriest nights. It was release. The immediate fallout inside the grand ballroom was absolute and catastrophic. The local bank president, the exact same man who had been enthusiastically shaking my father's hand just 20 minutes ago, aggressively turned his back on my mother and walked briskly out the side exit doors. Susan tried to follow him. She stumbled in her expensive high heels, grabbing desperately at the sleeve of his tailored suit, begging him to call his legal team to help Robert. The bank president forcefully pulled his arm away from her frantic grasp and loudly told her to never contact his financial institution again. The wealthy church elders gathered their coats and practically sprinted toward the main lobby, actively avoiding any eye contact with my sister. The carefully constructed, flawless illusion of my family's wealth and social status completely evaporated into thin air in less than 10 minutes. The criminal fallout unfolded over the weeks and months that followed, not in a single 48-hour rush. Robert and Trent were charged in connection with the forged HELOC, the wire transfer, the fraudulent credit accounts, and the identity theft documented in Miller's case. Their attorneys challenged parts of the evidence and argued over procedure, but the core paper trail remained the altered signature pages, the notarial records, the transfer into Trent's company, the access logs, and the family group chat discussing the plan. I did not attend every hearing. Thomas handled the legal communication, and I focused on separating my finances and my business from the wreckage they had created. What mattered to me was that I was no longer the person carrying their debt in silence. The allegations were attached to the people who had actually designed the scheme. Ashley and Susan faced the financial collapse that followed the arrests and the creditor actions. Ashley returned to the mansion to find formal notices waiting at the property. She was not thrown into the street by a private guard that night. The mortgage default and foreclosure process had to run through its legal steps. but the result was no less real. With Trent's accounts frozen, the fraudulent down payment source exposed, and my LLC controlling the mortgage note, Ashley could not maintain the house or cure the default. Over the following weeks, she was forced to leave the $1.2 million estate she had treated as proof of her superiority. The imported tile, the theater room, the marble counters, and the circular driveway all became reminders of a lifestyle built on money that had never belonged to them. Susan suffered the social collapse she had always feared more than poverty. Church friends who once competed for seats beside her stopped returning calls. The committees and social circles she had treated like a second career quietly removed her from invitations, and country club acquaintances, who had laughed at Robert's joke, suddenly acted as though they had barely known the family. Without access to the fraudulent money, with Robert's business under enforcement, and with the HELOC lender pursuing its separate remedies against my parents' house, Susan and Ashley could no longer maintain the home's clothes and appearances that had defined their status. Eventually, they ended up sharing a cramped two-bedroom rental, far from the gated community image they had tried so hard to project. The collapse of their status exposed how little of it had ever been stable. Susan had spent years treating acquaintances as a jury that could certify whether our family was worthy. Once the scandal became public, those same people protected their own reputations first. Ashley discovered that expensive rooms feel very different when the bills cannot be paid, and the title to the lifestyle is under legal attack. I did not call their friends or ask anyone to punish them. I did not need to. The consequences came from the choices they had made and the image they had built around those choices. For the first time, I stopped managing the emotional fallout for them. For months after the party, I had to resist the old reflex to solve problems for them. A voicemail from Susan could still trigger the instinct to calculate what it would cost to make the crisis disappear. An angry message from Ashley could still make me replay the argument and wonder whether I had gone too far. Then I would return to the evidence, the forged signature, the transfer receipt, the group chat, the plan to let me take the fall. Boundaries became easier when I stopped debating their intentions and looked at their actions. I did not need to hate them in order to stay away. I only needed to remember what contact had cost me. My secure cell phone soon began to fill with desperate, hysterical audio messages. I sat at the mahogany desk in my quiet home office and listened to them one by one. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt incredibly tired of their endless, toxic manipulation. Susan left a 5-minute voicemail sobbing hysterically into the receiver. She desperately begged me to release the frozen funds, claiming they did not even have enough liquid cash to hire a decent defense attorney for Robert. She heavily reminded me that she gave birth to me and demanded I show some basic familial loyalty in their darkest hour. Ashley left a separate, furious message screaming that I had completely ruined her perfect life and maliciously destroyed her marriage. She demanded I give her the luxury mansion back immediately. I did not return a single phone call. I ignored their desperate, tearful voicemails begging for mercy. I simply downloaded the encrypted audio files, forwarded them directly to Thomas Bradley for our ongoing legal records, and permanently blocked their phone numbers from my secure network. I completely washed my hands of them. I turned my attention to unwinding the financial wreckage. Robert's construction supply business could not be liquidated by magic, so Thomas and I followed the creditor process attached to the debt my LLC now held. The warehouse assets, remaining inventory, and commercial property were sold through the appropriate enforcement and sale procedures. The mansion followed only after the mortgage and foreclosure process reached the point where the property could lawfully be sold. I kept meticulous records of every recovery because I had spent too long watching my family treat numbers as if they could be bent by confidence. When the sales were complete and the lawful expenses and claims were accounted for, I directed the capital available to my company back into the expansion of my wealth management firm. Their collapse did not make me rich. I had already built that life. It simply stopped their fraud from owning any part of my future. 6 months after the country club disaster, I proudly signed a commercial lease for a massive new corporate headquarters. I moved my anonymous digital firm into the top floor of a towering modern glass building in downtown Portland. I hired a brilliant team of elite financial analysts, certified public accountants, and dedicated wealth managers. I walked into my private corner office on the very first day of operations. The walls were lined with breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy city streets, and the distant snow-capped mountains. I poured myself a fresh cup of hot, incredibly expensive coffee. I stood perfectly still by the cold glass, looking out over the sprawling city below me, and took a long, deep breath of clean air. I was no longer the exhausted, broken diner waitress, smelling of old grease and floor cleaner. I was no longer the pathetic scapegoat daughter, desperate for a tiny fraction of their conditional love. I was a highly successful chief executive officer. I looked out the window of my high-rise office finally, and completely free from the heavy, suffocating weight of people who never truly loved me. I kept one object from the diner in that new office, my old black order pad. It sat inside the top drawer of my desk, not as a symbol of shame, but as proof that two versions of my life had once existed side by side. The work at the diner had been real. The aching feet were real. The tips I handed Robert were real. So was the company I built after midnight. I no longer needed to erase one life to validate the other. What changed was that nobody else got to decide which parts of me counted. For 29 years, I believed that if I worked hard enough and sacrificed enough of myself, I could eventually earn a respected place at their table. I accepted the mockery, the neglect, the unpaid favors, and the way every family emergency somehow became my responsibility. I watched my own certification ceremony from a couch because Ashley wanted a weekend away, and I handed Robert cash after diner shifts while he praised Trent as the successful man in the room. I had confused endurance with love. Toxic people do not become grateful because you make yourself endlessly useful. They learn that your loyalty is a resource they can keep withdrawing. My father and my sister were willing to let my name carry a fraudulent debt because they had spent years teaching themselves that my needs did not count. Walking away was not a dramatic punishment. It was the first boundary they could not negotiate. If you are currently sitting in the dark shadows of your own family, desperately waiting for an apology that is never going to come, please listen to me carefully. Do not wait for them to magically validate your worth. They are fundamentally incapable of giving you the love and respect you actually need. Take all of that desperate, exhausted energy and pour it directly into your own bright future. Educate yourself. Protect your personal finances. Build a massive fortress of independence so strong that absolutely no one can ever threaten your stability or your peace of mind again. I learned the hard way that family is not blood, it is respect. And setting yourself on fire to keep others warm will only leave you in ashes. You owe absolutely nothing to people who treat your daily existence as a heavy inconvenience or a simple tool for their own selfish gain. You have the absolute, undeniable right to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. You have the right to build your own massive empire, fiercely protect your own peace, and construct a beautiful life entirely on your own terms. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? How did you finally break free? Let me know in the comments below. I draw immense strength from hearing how you reclaimed your own power. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there.